Okay, so to get started here, let's talk about the concept of ownership in our Friend Tracker app. The way that our app is currently set up, right? We basically have one user, and that user just has direct access to all of the data in the database, right? They have direct access to the entire friends collection. They have direct access to all of the favorites, and they have direct access to the user collection, which currently only has one user in it, right? Which is this user right here. Now, the concept of ownership comes in when basically we want to allow our application to have more than one user, right? So if we add another user over here, in fact, let's make them a different color here. There we go. If we add another user over here, we don't want both of these users to have unlimited access to all of our collections down here, right? Right? We don't want this user now to be able to access the friends created by this user here. We don't want them to be able to access that user's favorites or friends either, right? The entire purpose of this app is that each person, right, each user essentially has their own friends that they've created, right, and their own favorites, right? We'll just put them in there, right? And then our other user here would have their own collection of friends and favorites, etc., which I'll just draw like that again. Now, the way that we express ownership in the back end is usually by adding some kind of extra property to all of the data that we create that designates who that belongs to, right? Which user that data belongs to. Now, what we're essentially going to do in our database here, right, is instead of each of our friends just having name, age, blah, 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 and, each user being able to just directly access all of the friends, we're going to add an extra property to all of our friends, all of our favorites, and our users as well. That will basically be something like created by. And this property is going to contain the ID of the user who created it, right? So it'll look like something like that, if, assuming that that's an ID. Okay, and what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to change the database queries slightly that we're making inside our server routes. So instead of just saying, something like db.collection friends, and then saying, basically find all, we'll just say find blah, 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 we're going to actually filter these friends by this created by property. Okay, so that's really how this concept of ownership is expressed in databases. And there's a lot of other ways to do this, right? There are, for example, you could just have one collection, which is users, right? And each of these users could just have a property called friends, which is just an array containing that data directly, right? So it would contain the name, age, bio, etc. of all their friends. And then when a given user logs on, all you do is say db.collection users.find, and then you find that user by their ID, and that already contains the user's friends. It would also contain their favorites as well, and any other information that belongs to that user. Now, this way that I just described would work. However, as our application gets bigger, it's really a good idea to start splitting our resources into separate collections as we've already been doing in our application. So that's why we're approaching it in the way that we're going to, right? By keeping our friends, favorites, users separate and just adding a created by property to them, is that is really just more of a scalable solution, ultimately. So now that we've talked about this basic concept of ownership in full stack applications with multiple users, what we're going to do is we're going to first modify our Mongo database. So what I'm going to do is open up a new terminal. Okay, and I'll just open it up in the backend directory. Doesn't really matter where we do it because we're just going to open up a Mongo shell here by typing Mongo. Okay, and the first thing that we're going to need to do here is make a few changes to the data in our database. So if you open up your Firebase console for your project here, what you're going to see is that the user we created has this user ID. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take this ID and we're going to add it to all of the friends that we have in our application so far as the created by property, right? So essentially, what that'll tell our application once we've added this logic is that the current user, right, or all of the friends that we've created so far have been created by this user, and therefore only this user should be able to access and modify or, delete them. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy that. We're just going to click on this copy UID thing here. And we're going to go back to MongoDB. And what we're going to do, we're going to say use friend tracker DB. This was the database we created before, remember? And just to make sure you're in the right one, you're going to want to say show collections, and you should see favorites, friends, and users. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to add this created by property to all of our friends, and the way that we're going to do that is by saying db.friends.updateMany, and we're going to pass in an empty object for the filter because we want this to apply to all. And then we're going to say set, and we're going to say created by, and here's where we paste that ID that we just copied. And we're going to close the curly braces and the parentheses, and that should be all we have to do. So let's hit enter, and we should see that 3 of our friends were matched and 3 were modified, which basically means that this query that we put here, this update, has been applied to all of the friends in our database. Okay, now we don't need to worry about our favorites at this point unless you have any favorites in your database. Okay, so in other words, if you take a look at your application and there's anyone in your favorites, then you're going to need to run this same kind of query for your favorites as well. But in my case, right, if we say db.favorites.find, we're going to see that there's nothing there, so we'll just have to make some changes to the logic in our server in order to make sure that whenever a user adds someone to their favorites, this created by property is added to that as well. But anyway, just to make sure that all of your friends are looking good, let's say db.friends.find, and you can add .pretty on the end too to make it a little more readable. And what you should see is that all of your friends are in there, and they all now have this created by property added to them, which is the ID of the user, right? Currently our only user in our application. So the next thing that we're going to need to do here is, just like we added this ID to all of our friends, we're going to need to add it to our user as well. Except instead of adding it as a created by property, we're going to add it as simply an ID to identify the user. Now this is going to be different, right? If we say db.users.find, this is going to be different from the Mongo ID, which is just an automatically generated random ID that Mongo applies to all of the documents that we insert. But basically what we're going to do is stop using this Mongo ID altogether and just add a completely different ID field that we'll use instead. So what we're going to do is just say db.users.update, and there's only one user in our database now, so we can just say update with an empty filter object. And what we're going to do is say set, and we're going to set a property called ID without the underscore. And for that, we're going to paste the user's ID that we copied from Firebase. Okay, so let's hit enter, and we should see an modified one. And if you say db.users.find, and you can say .pretty again as well if you want, you should see that this user now has an extra ID property, which is what we're going to use to basically link up Firebase auth with the data in our database and also establish who owns what in our application. Okay, so those are pretty much all of the changes that we're going to need to make to our database. So the next thing that we're going to do, right, you're going to want to exit out of the Mongo shell there because we don't need that anymore for the time being. You're going to want to open up your server file. Okay, so let's go to friend tracker server source, and let's open up server here. And essentially what we're going to need to do in here now is modify all of our database queries in order to take the changes that we've established into account. So essentially, right, just using the friends as an example here, instead of saying find all, which is essentially what this query means, we're going to say find all of the friends in the friends collection only if their created by property is equal to whatever the ID is of our current user. Okay, and we're basically going to do that same thing for all of the endpoints in our application so far. So that'll look something like this, and for now we're just going to hard code that ID. I'll show you how we can have our front end send along auth tokens that we'll be able to verify on the back end, but we'll get there in a little while. So what we're going to do is just say created by, and we're going to paste that ID in here again, and basically what that will do is get all of the friends whose created by property is equal to that. Now note that this will still be all of the friends in our application so far, because at this point we don't have any other users that have created friends in our application. So now that we have that, we're going to go down to our next endpoint, which is going to be the favorites endpoint. And we're going to want to do the same thing that we did up in our friends endpoint with our favorites. So essentially what we're going to do with loading favorites, right? Each of our favorites, just like each of our friends, is going to have its own created by property. That'll just help us know which user created each of these favorites so that we don't have to actually load each of the friends associated with these favorites in order to know, if the user actually has access to that record or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the same thing here. We're going to say created by and paste that user ID where we load all of our favorites. And the rest of the stuff should be good. Okay, next up, when we load an individual friend, we're going to need to check and make sure that that user owns that data. Okay, so this is going to be a little different than what we saw up above. What we're going to need to do essentially is after we load our friend up here, and after we've made sure that that friend actually exists in the database with that ID, we're going to need to check and make sure that the user, right, the friends created by property is equal to the ID of the user who's trying to load this data. So for now, again, we're just going to hard code the user's ID. I'll show you later on how to make this actually line up with the currently logged in user on the front end. And we're just going to say if that is not equal to our friends created by property, then what we're going to want to do is return a 403 status code signifying that whoever's trying to load that data does not have access to it. Okay, so we'll just say response.sendStatus 403, and that should be all we need to do there. So next thing, we're going to go down to our load user data endpoint, and essentially all we have to do here is make sure that the user who's trying to load, this user profile is actually that user. So all we really need to do here is check to make sure that the user's ID, which again we're going to hard code, is if that's not equal to the user ID that they're trying to load, we're just going to say return response.sendStatus 403, and that's all we need to do in that case. Oh, and just one more thing here. We do need to add a return statement here just to make sure that our server doesn't try and execute this other response.json thing. All right, so we're moving right along. Let's go to our next one, creating friends. Okay, this is where we actually have to set that created by property to begin with. So essentially, in addition to the new friend info that's being sent to us by the front end, we're also going to want to include a created by property with the current user's ID. So all we have to do for that is we're just going to say, use the spread operator on the request body to get all of the new friend info. And under that, we're going to add a created by property with this thing as the value. And that's all we need there. Okay, that should automatically insert this created by property into our database when a given user creates a new friend in our application. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is the favorites here. For the favorites, we're going to do essentially the same thing that we did up here in friends. All we need to do here is, in addition to this, the ID of the friend that the user is currently marking as a favorite, we also need to add the created by property there. Oops, that should be created by. Okay, we're going to paste that. And let me just make sure I have created by in all of these and not create by. Ah, yes, okay, I mistyped that one. I saw that in the autocomplete and I was like, I think I made a typo somewhere. So I'm glad I caught that because that could be a pretty dastardly bug there. So let's go down to, let's see, where were we? We were in our favorites, and our favorites are now adding the same created by property as before. So let's do our 2 delete endpoints. These ones are going to be pretty straightforward. We just need to make sure that the user actually is the one who created that friend record in our database. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to need to load this friend by ID before we actually allow the user to delete it, right? Because we need to make sure that the created by property on that friend in our database is equal to the ID of the user who's trying to delete it. So what this is going to look like, we're going to say const friend equals db.collection friends, and we're going to use the find one query, and we're basically just going to find the friend by their ID. We're going to say ID, object ID, friend ID. Okay, and that should successfully load that data. So all we need to do now is make sure that that friends created by property is equal to the ID of the current user. So we're just going to say if, and we're going to use that thing again, is not equal to friend.createdBy. We're going to send back a 403 status code by saying return response.send status 403. Pretty straightforward. We're going to do the same thing now with our favorites. So essentially, I'm just going to copy and paste this, and we'll see how to simplify this logic a little later on because it is getting a little repetitive. Okay, so let's just paste that there. We're going to say const favorite, and we're going to say db.collection favorites.find1. And instead of ID, we're going to use the favorite, or no, rather friends ID property, and that's just going to be friend ID. Oh, you know what? That's the same thing. So we can just say friend ID like that. Okay? And just like we did before, we're going to say if that does not equal favorite.createdBy, then we're going to send back that same status code as before. All right, so those are our delete endpoints. And now, last but not least, we come to our update endpoints. Hopefully you're getting the idea of how all of this works by now. But let's do our update endpoints. The first one is the endpoint for updating a user's profile information. Now, what this one is going to look like, essentially, it's actually quite easy. We just need to make sure that this user ID in the query parameter, or in the URL parameter rather, is equal to the user's ID. So the way we do that is by saying if, then we're going to paste that. Oops, looks like I copied and pasted too much. You know what? Let me just go back and get the original ID from our Firebase console. I'm going to say copy UID, and we'll just say if, and then paste that string there, is not equal to user ID. Then what we're going to do is say return response send status 403. Okay, that should protect that route just fine. And next, let's go to our friends/friend ID. And for this one, we're going to want to load our friend before allowing access. So we can actually just go up to where we were originally loading our friends and copy and paste this exact logic. I believe that that will all work exactly the way we want it to. So I'm just going to paste that in there. And sure enough, it looks like that's all we need. So basically, again, we're getting our friend. We're making sure that the friend's created by property is equal to the user's ID before we allow anybody to make changes to it. And that is all of our routes. So what you can do now is test out the application with the single user that we've created so far, and everything should work just like it did before. So what we're going to do is say npm run start. Okay, we're going to start up the front end. We're going to start up the back end if you don't already have it running. Oops, there we go. And everything should work the same way as before, except now we've added this concept of ownership to all of the data in our application by using the ID of the currently logged in user. So let's go back to here, and it looks like we're running into some kind of error, so let's try this again. We're just going to open up the network, let's refresh our application and see what's going wrong here. Oh, you know what? It looks like everything worked, so I guess it was just a fluke. Okay, so we see that we have all of our original friends, and If we click on add to favorites on one of them, that should work. Remove from favorites should work. Oops, it looks like that's not working. Let's see what the error is there. Let's try and remove someone from favorites. And we see that we're getting a 403 on that, which is a little puzzling. So let's go take a look at this. Okay, we're going to go up to our remove favorites endpoint, which is in app.delete favorites/friend ID. And we need to add a wait to this. Maybe that's why it wasn't working. And actually, we need to do the same thing to all of these. Okay, I believe we did that up there. Yes, we have it, we have it, we have it. Okay, it looks like I didn't... Oh, here we go. I missed it in this place too. Just make sure that you've added a wait before db.collection, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and just to make sure, just doing a visual scan here, it looks like we have it all. So let's try this again. We're going to refresh the page. We should be able to remove Carl from our favorites now. Looks like that's working. Let's try editing our friends now. So we're going to do edit info, and we'll try just changing this to something like that. Click Save Changes. Sure enough, it looks like that's working correctly. Let's try adding a new friend now, and we'll see if that friend actually shows up in our friends list. So we're just going to add a very simple friend here, John Doe, age, we'll say 32, profile picture URL, we'll leave blank, bio, we'll just type in something real quick, birthday, Jan 1st, interests, food, movies, travel, click on create, and sure enough, we see that John Doe shows up, and we should be able to delete this user as well if we go down here and click on delete friend. Oops, it looks like that's not working, so let's check and see what the error is there. If we open up our network tab again, click on delete friend, it looks like that's causing some kind of error on the server, which is causing the server to hang up. So let's go back here. All right, so let's go back and take a look at this request here. Oh, you know what? This request is going to the favorites endpoint because basically what's happening here is our front end, when we delete a friend, is trying to remove them from the favorites. And this is to make sure that we don't end up with a dangling favorite, so to speak, without a friend object in the database that corresponds to it. Okay, so essentially what we need to do here, I suppose, is we need to go into delete favorites friend ID, and we need to basically check and see if that favorite exists before performing this logic, right? If the favorite doesn't exist, then that's fine. We don't need to worry about it. If it does exist, we want to delete it. So let's say if favorite, okay, and we're going to put all of this logic in here except for the response.send status because we want that to happen regardless of whether or not the favorite exists. And that should be all we need to do there to make this work. So let's try this again. What we're going to do is just refresh this to make sure it's all working. We're going to click on John Doe again. And what we'll do is say delete friend, and that should successfully delete the friend as we wanted. Okay, now one last thing that I wanted to show you here is what would happen if we change the created by property of one of our existing friends here to make it something other than the currently logged in user. Well, essentially what would happen there is one of these friends, we would just stop seeing it because this logged in user would no longer have access to it. So what we're going to do, just to simulate this, is first of all, let's make sure that none of our users are in our favorites, since that will complicate things. And we're going to open up a Mongo shell again by saying Mongo. Whoops, I'm in caps lock there. And we're going to say use friend tracker DB for our database, and we're going to say db.friends.find, and we'll say .pretty to make it more readable. Okay, and what we'll see here, let's take Carl. We're going to pick on him, and we're going to take his object ID, and we're basically going to change the created by to something else. So what we're going to do is just say db.friends.update, okay, and we're only going to update one here, so we'll just say update one, and we're going to paste that ID property like that. And the update that we're going to do is to set Carl's created by property, okay, created by, we'll just set it to something like 123, right? This is to simulate the ID of another user in our application. All right, so let's hit enter now, and Carl no longer belongs to us. So what we're going to do is refresh our app, And let's see what happened here. It looks like we got an error. Oh, our server's not running anymore. That's why. Let's try that again. We're going to say npm run dev. Okay, and let's go back here and try refreshing again. And sure enough, we'll only see the two friends that still have the created by ID equal to the currently logged in user. So let's just change Carl back real quick. What we're going to do, let's just take this created by property from before. We're going to use that same query, except we're going to change created by here to the old one. And now if we go back here and hit refresh, we should see that Carl is back in our friends. Okay, so just to review here, what we've seen is how to add the concept of ownership to the data in our application so that we can make sure that data belongs to specific users and that other users can't access that. So I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.